Welcome. I'm Professor Roy Gardner. I'm the Director of the Institute for Biodiversity Law and Policy here at Stetson University College of Law, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the fourth annual Environmental Law Institute Stetson Wetlands Workshop. We have a number of folks to thank. In particular, I'd like to start off by thanking Catherine Campbell of the Environmental Law Institute to help us with co-sponsoring and organizing this conference. I'd also like to thank Frank Hearn. Is Frank back? Frank is not back yet from the field trip. Frank is with Mechanic, Nucio, Hearn, and Wester, and they are sponsoring the poolside reception after today's workshop. And it was also really Frank's idea to try to bring together the wetlands and the brownfields community. I'd like to thank the Environmental and Land Use Law section of the Florida Bar, also for co-sponsoring. And then we've got some folks internally we need to thank as well, Damon and Dan of Media Services. Thank you for all of the technical support and also for the webcast that we are doing. So we have some people who are joining us over the web. So we started off this morning actually with a couple of interesting site visits. First was to the restoration of the Eulali Spring, right adjacent to the Tampa Law Center. So thank Tom Reese and Dan Fahey for talking to us about efforts to restore that site. And then we stopped by the before picture, a true brownfield site, a landfill site in Pinellas County, and we learned about the plans for that from Terry Hasbrook, and we appreciate her time and insights. So what we're going to do today is we have a couple of main speakers. Each of those speakers will be followed by a panel, and then we'll also open up for discussion from the audience. So our first session is going to be on state and local regulation and protection of wetlands. We'll also then have a session on brownfields as potential wetland mitigation sites. And then we'll have a breakout session after that. We'll go into smaller groups to discuss in more detail some of the issues that are raised in this plenary session. And then we'll conclude with the poolside networking reception that is sponsored by Frank's firm. So I hope that you can stay and join us for that. So our first speaker is giving the Edward and Bonnie Foreman Biodiversity Lecture. And so the purpose of this lecture series is to foster a dialogue among students, academics, attorneys, policymakers, environmental scientists, and other stakeholders who we've brought here together because the successful resolution of the many environmental challenges we face as a society requires an interdisciplinary perspective. And so the lecture series is made possible through the generous support of a great friend of Stetson, Bonnie Foreman. So Bonnie, thank you so much for all that you do for the university and in particular for sponsoring this lecture series. Also just walking in right now was Frank Hearn. Let's give Frank a round of thanks. As I was telling them, Frank, before you walked in, that it was your idea to bring together the brownfields community and the wetland restoration community, and then also your firm is sponsoring the poolside reception, which we greatly appreciate. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our Foreman Biodiversity lecturer, Jeanne Christie. And I've known Jeanne for many years, since somewhere between 15 and 20. And she is the executive director of the Association of State Wetland Managers and has been since 2001. She works in that capacity extensively to assist states in developing wetland programs and to identify opportunities to better integrate state, federal, and local wetland programs. She has a very broad background working with federal agencies and 4 federal agencies and state agencies, including the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resource Conservation Service, the Environmental Protection Agency and its Wetlands Division, and also with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. She's come down from Maine to join us, and I also want to note that she was awarded the 2007 National Wetlands Award for Education and Outreach. Please welcome Jeanne Christie.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am very happy to be here, and I'll figure this out in a second. I love working in the field of wetlands, science, law, and policy. It is fascinating to me on many levels, and it's full of sudden and extraordinary twists and turns, either in the court systems or in new things we learn about the science, or dramas unfolding in the fields. Roy has been kind enough to do some webinars with us and helping us understand Clean Water Act jurisdiction over the last couple years, as there's been some rulemaking that's gone ahead, and sometimes we feel like it's better than a soap opera because of all the things that just happened. So I'm here today to talk a little bit about, I'm going to start at the national level to give us some context and understanding, and then move down and talk about the unique and important roles that state and local government play in protecting and conserving wetlands for folks locally as well as people nationally. I also love to be out in wetlands. This picture here is at the very edge of the United States, looking out towards Canada in the Bay of Fundy. You get up early in the morning and you never know what you're going to see. And so it takes me a minute to figure out what is forward. Oh, there it is. And then earlier this year, I was in Scotland, and I went out on one of those boat trips, and they said, oh, if you go out to this little cliff here and sit, the puffins will come up and sit with you. And I thought, right, you know, you go up on a cliff and you sit, and the puffins are going to come up and hang out with you. But that is, in fact, what happens, because puffins are preyed upon by seagulls, and when all the tourists show up and sit around, the puffins can come all up and hang out, and the seagulls can't come and eat them and whatnot. So we got to hang out with puffins for a day, which I don't think you can do any place in the United States. They don't really let you get close to them. So you never know when your opportunities are going to arise. Just real quick review, wetlands are area that get wet. It's got a nice technical definition. That's what you can see up there. But they're areas, and the way that we identify them is, it's called 3-parameter approach. We look at the vegetation, the soils, which bear the marks of being filled with water frequently, and then of course the hydrology or the water is what drives them. So the way we identify wetlands in the United States is by requiring all 3 to be showing signs that it is in fact a wet area. And I like to say this often, wetlands or the United States is the most ecologically diverse country on earth. We're not the biggest, but we have more different kinds of landscapes, of forests, of deserts, of wetlands in particular. So, you know, we range from down here when we're in the tropics, we have mangroves. It goes all the way up into Alaska and the tundra. And we've got areas of the country that receive less than 7 inches of rain a year, and others that receive, I guess in Kauai, in excess of 200 inches of rain. And our mountains go north to south, which is important when you have glaciers and you're thinking about biodiversity, because in Europe and Asia, the mountains go east to west, so a lot of diversity can get crowded out with the movement of glaciers, and that's not so in this country. So that means that the challenges are significant because, frankly, wetlands from one part of the country to another do not look the same. They all share that same characteristics of the presence of water, part of the growing season, and soils and vegetation that reflects that, but they vary dramatically from one area of the country to the other, which means that the challenges for states and local communities in trying to figure out how to deal with these areas is they're different challenges from one part of the country to the other because the wetlands themselves are different. And the others were not taken in Florida. This one's actually over near Jacksonville. And this is a bog environment up near where I live in Maine. And there are kinds of wetlands that don't have vegetation in tidal areas. We have very large tides in the Northeast and going up the coast of Maine. And there's a lot of wetlands that frankly don't look very wet. This is actually, it's either a bog or a fen, and this is the kind of a landscape where, you know, people go walking around, all of a sudden they go, whoop, they disappear down through the vegetation because they're floating on water and they don't find them for a couple hundred years. So just because it looks dry on top doesn't mean it's not a wetland. You have to know what you're looking at to know whether you're seeing someplace that's going to be dry some or all of the year or not. In thinking about federal policy and wetlands protection and regulation, we like to describe the federal government as kind of, well, the states say they're the basement, and the federal folks say, well, at least say we're the first floor. You know, we don't really want to be in the basement all the time. But there are a number of environmental laws, Clean Water Act numbered among them, which provide a level of protection. And some states and some local communities are content to allow that to be the level, but many, many others add to and provide additional layers of protection. There are certain things that the federal government does. It's embodied in our Constitution, our laws, our regulations. They have these big environmental laws, direct regulatory powers. The federal government gives out a lot of money in various different forms for clean water grants and infrastructure building, but for agriculture, emergency responses. The federal government has the ability to look at issues and problems and research them at the national level and look at various kinds of challenges broadly. And then they manage a lot of land. When you think about it, particularly out west, but even here in Florida, they are a major land manager. And among the national studies that have been done were a number that were published by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service starting in the, I think, late 80s, looking at the rates of wetland loss nationally. And this highlights how a report can shape and direct national policy. So the initial report showed that we're losing wetlands between the mid-50s and the mid-70s at about 500,000 acres a year. So 500,000, and so that galvanized people to start thinking about wetlands and start thinking that there is something that needed to be done. And this is very important. They identified a problem, they characterized it, they gave it dimension by doing this. And part of what they looked at, and looking even farther back, is they identified that half the wetlands in the country had been lost, 100 million or so acres. Give or take a little. And the states that are the darker color, like the dark green states up there along the Mississippi River, had some of the greatest loss, but you know, California's lost 95% plus. The yellow states lost quite a bit. Now, it's interesting, and just look down at Florida there. It's not showing a huge amount of loss in terms of percentage, but wetlands, Florida has lost more wetlands than any other state. Florida's lost more wetlands than any other state in the country. It's because there were a lot here to begin with, and obviously now there's a lot of people, but 9.3 million acres is a lot. And so when you look at the U.S. map at the top, you can see the states where wetlands were distributed prior to European settlement, and you can see the reduction in acres that occurred later on. So these are enormous changes on the landscape. Many years ago when I was working for the Department of Agriculture with the Wetlands Reserve Program, And we're doing, you know, 100,000, got 100,000 acres of wetlands restoration underway, and we're looking at these projects all over the country and how to get them back. The man running the program at the time said, well, you know, these are really just postage stamps on top of a much larger altered landscape. So that, I can't overstate the challenge for people trying to figure out how to restore and protect these areas. We have replumbed the United States, and even though, you know, we don't see the evidence of that in some places, when you start looking more carefully, you find out that it is changed, and there's a cost associated. In Maine, we have 5 seasons. We have spring, winter, fall. Summer, winter, fall, spring, and mud season. And so in mud season, everybody goes on vacation. This is up north during mud season. So wildlife habitat, there are consequences to wildlife in return for losing wetlands. And a lot of the initial interest in protecting wetlands nationally was related to the migratory birds and all the ducks and whatnot that came down, particularly through the Central Flyway, but we value them for many other reasons. And when you look at this is part of a worldwide study at the loss of freshwater dependent biodiversity, it is discouraging to see the number of wetlands or the number of species of amphibians, mussels, birds, et cetera, that are endangered by their loss. It's because these areas are so unique that many wetlands are either critical for the entire life cycle of birds and animals and whatnot, or they may be very critical for just one part of the life cycle. But when we lose wetlands on the landscape, when we change their characteristics, there are consequences for wildlife. There are other consequences as well. And with respect to water and just the availability of water, we know that we're having to use more and more water in recent years. And this, the green on the bottom is agriculture specifically, but here and throughout the country, we need to use water for a variety of sort of human needs, and that's going to compete with the natural world. And then when we look at water quality, I think folks are generally aware that there's this hypoxia or dead zone where folks down in the Gulf, fishermen in particular, encounter these areas where there's no oxygen in the water and fish and other wildlife cannot exist. And so if you look at where there are water quality problems in this hypoxia zone, and then if we go back to where wetlands were lost historically, we see that the areas that are contributing the highest amounts of phosphorus and nitrogen are also the areas of the country where we've lost the more wetlands, lost the most wetlands. Now it's a complicated issue. I'm not going to imply that we have water quality problems just because wetlands are gone, but these areas are heavily farmed now. There's a lot of nutrients put onto the land, and the lack of the filtering capacity of wetlands certainly prevents some of the cleanup that might otherwise have occurred when it was in a less altered state. And we have no idea how many hundreds of thousands of miles of drainage tile exist beneath this agricultural land. Nobody's ever had to record or report on where these are. And we had a webinar earlier this year looking at restoring some urban landscapes, and we had a fellow do a presentation where he'd done this absolutely marvelous development on some old ag lands, and he removed 5 different sets of drainage tiles on that one piece of landscape. So it hadn't been drained once, it had been drained 5 times over the period of 200 years. So the extent of drainage, which is, you know, it's hidden, it's out of sight, it's underneath, and how that's altering our water quality and the availability of water are things that we appreciate we have a problem, but we're not sure how to address. And then we have, obviously, flooding and hurricanes and whatnot here and other places. And this is looking at the costs of hurricanes and floods and other natural disasters, like the tornadoes that came through the country a couple years ago was actually a pretty significant natural disaster. But what I want to point out on here is the third one from the low bar is Hurricane Rita, which is looks like it's a pretty small natural disaster. But when you look at wetlands that were lost from having that hurricane come through, you can see that even maybe something that's not considered a really large natural disaster has significant impacts. And then, of course, there are the concerns about climate change and changing precipitation and temperature. And here in Florida, there's the potential for sea level rise to impact it substantially. You go to this website and it gives you 7 meters. I mean, that's what it defaults to, which is a little dramatic because that's 7 times 3 is like 21 feet of sea level rise. I chose 3 meters, 9 feet, and there's a fair number of models that are showing that that's a distinct possibility. And if you look at that, if I were to zoom into the Tampa area, there is a lot of very low land here that would disappear. And I don't really know much about this model, so I don't know if they're just looking at water levels coming up or if they're making any calculations about the erosion and loss of adjacent land that would occur as the water came up. It's a complex issue, but these are things that folks that are working not just at the federal level, but obviously this is going to be a local issue as it starts to occur and a state issue as well. So we're trying to look at how to shape federal and state and local policy. A gentleman in Delaware a number of years ago was trying to persuade the state legislature to have a more proactive wetlands program, and he says, well, you can't change anything unless you can answer these 3 questions. You have to be able to identify what's at risk, why is it important, and what will it take to fix it. And if you can't go to your governor or go to your legislature or go to anybody and answer those so that it makes sense to them, you're pretty much dead in the water in terms of bringing about change. But there are successful efforts, and I hearken back to around 88, 89, there was a report published by the National Wetlands Policy Forum where we first came up with this term that's become pretty much embedded in national and local and state wetland policy, which is no net loss of wetlands. And so the story goes that then Governor Keene of New Jersey took a walk with President-elect Bush and talked about this report, and even prior to being sworn into office, the President-to-be Bush made some speeches talking about no net loss, which signaled all of the federal agencies to get to work on it right away. And we didn't. So even before he was elected, there were agencies looking at this report and trying to figure out what to do. And in particular, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, some folks there read it. And you have to think about it. They're the Army. And Army follows the Commander-in-Chief. So this was when I was working at EPA in the Wetlands Program. And after years of EPA and the Corps battling each other, all of a sudden we saw significant accommodation by the Corps of the positions EPA had been pursuing, and that's where we came up with this policy that we've been following ever since of avoidance, minimization, and compensatory mitigation. And what in fact happened is we didn't learn to say no to the loss of wetlands. We didn't say, no, you shouldn't fill there, you should just find another place to do your project. We said, well, we don't want to have to deal with the takings issues and all this other stuff, so we'll just put a wetland someplace else. And essentially that's been our compromise since then in a very simplistic sense. And I would suggest that we were extremely optimistic about our ability to just put a wetland someplace else. And we've been wrestling with that ever since. It is, I mentioned earlier, we have this altered landscape, and that creates a lot of challenges, and my organization and many others have spent a lot of time thinking about, are we really putting back on the landscape anything like we have lost or are trying to replace? And I will defer that discussion to some of the panelists later on in the afternoon. But we know a lot more about wetlands restoration now than we did when we started the national mitigation policy. And then more recently, we started looking at the health of wetlands, and not only are we losing them on the landscape or not, but are they healthy wetlands or not? And so EPA published the first ever National Wetlands Condition Report this year. And, we came up with some numbers saying that about half of them were in good condition and then others were in poor condition, and that the reasons they were in poor condition related to compacted soil. They called it soil hardening in the report, which confused everybody, but it's basically compacting the soil, ditching, not surprising, loss of vegetation, things that you would think would harm the landscape anyway, but they're things that are pervasive and occur every place across the landscape. So the Clean Water Act at the national level is what we've been using for years to help protect wetlands, but as I mentioned earlier, this is courtesy of Kim Diana Connolly up at SUNY Law School in Buffalo. There are some serious shortcomings in the ability to use the Clean Water Act to protect wetlands, in particular following some Supreme Court cases over the last couple decades, so that it's become, there are many, many wetlands and other waters that are not protected under the Clean Water Act. And so the question becomes, who could protect them, or how could they protect them? Because this is my view of national wetland policy right now. We've got an act from 1972 that has basically been sent back to the shop for repair and alteration a lot of times without having the ability of Congress to go and revise it and bring it up to date. So it's pretty much kind of patched together so that it works, and in some respects it works well. I mean, this mailbox is going to do what the mailbox is supposed to do. The guy's going to come and deliver it every day, but it's got some serious structural issues that are likely to turn up at some point in time. So the second level of ability to protect and conserve and take care of wetlands happens at the states, because states have many of the same authorities and abilities to do things that I mentioned for the federal level. They are delegated many parts of the Clean Water Act to carry out, as well as many other environmental programs. I mean, in the last couple decades, I think a significant change at the state level has been the diversity and the amount of regulatory programs that the state has. Are you giving me my 10-minute? Okay. So there's a fair amount of parallel here between what the federal government can do, but there's, now we're getting into state growth and a little bit of land use management activities, and then other things as well that are very similar to the federal level. But now we can tailor it more to the state's needs because we're at the state level. And as a result, when we look across the country, states are highly variable. They've got different natural systems to deal with, the way economic drivers, et cetera, are all very different from one part of the country to the other, so that what wetlands you have, where they are, et cetera, are not in Florida. It's very different here than what it would be in like California or where I live up in Maine. I mean, you guys don't have any snow. Pretty big deal. We average 57 inches of snow a year, and I go snowmobiling. Well, I don't go snowmobiling, I go snowshoeing and cross-country skiing, but those are not forms of recreation, for example, down here. So how they look at the various issues that they have is going to vary from one state to the next. And we recently, the problems that are occurring, the rate of loss can vary from one area to the other. And so this is a report that was done between 2004 and 2009, and it's showing you the bars showing the rate of coastal wetland loss around the Gulf and up the East Coast. And you can see that there are areas in Florida that are experiencing significant amounts of wetland loss according to this report. So we recently interviewed all 50 states about their programs and what they did and how they addressed their various challenges that they had from state to state. And this is on our website, and it's an 80-page analysis, and then every state has its own individual summary. So you can read 15 pages about Florida's program, and then you can look at how it potentially stacks up against other programs. So we look at those states that decide to have a regulatory program, a dredge and fill permitting program of some type that mirrors what the Corps does and under the Clean Water Act. And the blue states have their own dredge and fill permitting program. The purple states have some kind of a coastal program only, and then the blue states don't do anything. They use Section 401 of the Clean Water Act to condition federal permits, including 404 permits, but they have no standalone dredge and fill program. We took a look at how many states have their own mitigation policies for programs, and there's some states that have additional mitigation policies that may not necessarily have regulatory programs, but in conditioning federal permits, they may exercise those. And you'll see that it's variable across the country, and the different colors relate to whether it's in place or it's under development, and then the pink states don't have anything in addition. So then we said, well, there's regulation, but what about voluntary restoration programs? How many states go out and encourage people through their own state laws and regulations to restore wetlands? And when we looked at standalone projects, that's the one on the left here. There were some states, and then we kind of looked at, well, who has sort of entrepreneurial restoration programs or things that kind of happen on an ad hoc basis, and we came up with some additional states that do that. But still, you're seeing a lot of diversity across the country. I referred to the National Wetland Condition Assessment Report earlier, and so we also looked at, how many states are trying to figure out what the health is of their wetlands. And the green states, which include Florida, may or may not be part of wetland monitoring programs. We were not able to identify, Florida has some integrated monitoring, but in terms of actually going out and looking at the health of its wetlands, it's not an active area as far as we could tell for the state. This is an area where there's a lot of growth, a lot of work being done. Because if you can figure out how healthy it is or what a healthy wetland is, you know what to mitigate for, you know what to restore for, you can have some goals about managing the resource over time. And then we looked at staffing, and the variability on here is that the red states have less than one full-time employee running, one of these programs in the state. So the upper left is the regulatory program, and all the states that are red have less than one person at the state level that run the 401 certification program for their state. So they might be doing Section 319 non-point source and 401 certification. You look down, Florida is a blue state, which is, it says 20 plus full-time employees up to 300, and the up to 300 was just for Florida because it's a very, very active program. These were very difficult questions to ask the states because there's not a wetland budget per se. There's funding that comes from many different sources. So we got some information, but the bottom line we came away with is that in many states, even if they tell us they have a relatively robust, mature program, when you look at the number of staff they actually have carrying it out, you have to sort of wonder how effective those programs are. And we also looked at, well, so how much are they working with their stormwater folks or their flood reduction folks or others? And so this part of the report examines, what are the areas that they're commonly working together, and stormwater management is the high bar. That's where we got the most feedback that the wetlands people and the stormwater people were working with and talking to each other. And when we got down to wildlife action plans, ironically, that's where the least coordination was going on between the folks that we talked to. So this report exists on our website. It is at aswm.org and under states, the drop-down menu, and I invite you to look through it. There's a whole series of maps like this for each of the program areas we looked at, and in addition we looked at climate change too and some other things. And it was a fascinating picture of what the states are doing. I will add that the recession that hit the country as a whole also, not surprisingly, hit environmental programs and water programs and wetland programs pretty hard. And the staffing that was cut in response to those lean years has not been restored by and large in water programs in general and as well as wetland programs. So I find it to be an area of concern to think about the fact that water is likely to become a more and more scarce and important commodity, and that state investment, at least if you're going to use the Their investment in having robust state staff to address these issues is not being sort of restored in recent years, and I think the challenges are going to get larger. So when you're looking at state wetland policy, I have a bunch of people wandering around because everybody's doing things a little bit different here. You can't really generalize about states at all. They're all different. So he's going to let me keep going here. Okay, but I'm going to zoom through the local government because folks are going to be talking about this afternoon. But what's important here is local government, unlike the state and federal level, they have some responsibilities that are very different. They can do wetland programs, and some do, and they have shoreline zoning, but they do zoning. This is where land use regulation happens. They're carrying out a lot of the water use, the actual sort of floodplain programs, the public works projects. The exact trade-off between responsibilities between state and local government is variable from state to state, and some local governments have more autonomy in what they do, but there are a whole series of tools that local government has that really do not exist at the federal and state level. And so that's why a partnership, a collaborative way of working together, I think is absolutely essential when you're dealing with some of these programs we have here. And I wanted to speak, these are some graphics I've taken from the Center for Watershed Protection from a presentation they did. But when you just think about impervious surfaces, and this is parking lots and buildings and roads, and the relationship of how much of the land is covered by concrete versus water quality, you can see that the more you cover the land with concrete, the worse your water quality gets. So when you get up to about 25%, you're in the red zone. You're just, it's dropping off precipitously. And to really understand that, you need to, I need to visualize, well, so how much is 1% and how much is 25%? So put a house on 2 acres of land, you're already up to 10%. You've got a 1 acre residential, you're 14. When you start to see these nice and spread out subdivisions, you're at 20. Remember I told you 25 is when things start really looking grim. And quite honestly, when I drive around Tampa, I'm not feeling really good about the water quality here because I'm seeing an awful lot of concrete. So you can see, once again, that once you start, it's a pretty simple test in my mind, and I don't want to say that there's nothing that can be done about it, but at the very least, there has to be very, very active management to try to maintain any kind of water quality when you get in these urban areas. And, up here, this is what a stream is supposed to look like. It's supposed to be kind of close to the floodplain. You might have a bank or not, but then as you put impervious surfaces in, you start seeing, that there's this downcutting and undercutting and this erosion, and they just don't, this should not look right to anybody. When you go and walk out and look at a stream and you see that it is several feet below the floodplain or the bank, to me that's a reason to be thinking that perhaps you're in an area where there are some real issues. And of course here you have canals every place that kind of look like this without the erosion. And then when it gets up over 60%, frequently, the river's actually underneath the urban area. Where I used to live in Washington, D.C., folks that had been there a long time would point out where there were creeks that were essentially running underneath the downtown of the city that had been covered for a long, long time. And now there's a lot more creative ways of dealing with this than there were historically. But these are significant challenges for us, and as the water quality goes, the wetlands are going to be affected as well. And I really don't distinguish between wetlands and streams because they're all part of one system. And I'm not going to go into these. There are a lot of tools at the local level that can be used for dealing with these in various types of conservation to try to have more green area in the landscape, which folks that are working at the local level know a lot more about than me. But just, I think these are my last 2 slides. So I think about how federal, state, and local government is organized. And you know, at the state and federal level, you have your executive branch, your legislative branch, and your judicial branch. And you know, for those of you studying to be lawyers, you're probably going to be spending quite a bit of time dealing with the judicial branch, but maybe not. And then when you get down into the local level, you've got counties and, you know, water management districts, towns and municipalities, and you've got how that's organized. But they tend to have these, you know, straight, rigid boundaries around them. And when we're dealing with waters and wetlands, you know, this is, they don't have these nice straight boundaries. They don't split themselves up along the lines that we've made for our cities and the towns, but they do have their own ways of organizing together. So this is just a base map here, but this is a map. I've added the streams. You can see the streams coming through. And now added to that are the wet soils. So these were probably, at least historically, who knows what's there now, these would have been where wetlands quite likely might have been. And this is the National Wetlands Inventory, so you can see where the hydric soils were on this place, that they overlay each other pretty well. So streams and floodplains and wetlands all belong together, and we have separated them in our minds, and our disciplines separate them. If I go talk to a wetland restoration specialist, they won't know typically anything about streams, and if I talk to a stream restoration person, they don't know anything about wetlands. And yet, historically, these systems just merged into each other. You know, there weren't these artificial boundaries that have been created by draining and leading to downcutting and straightening that we see today. So the landscape we see does not reveal those associations to us in the way it would historically. So here are some ideas. You know, we have to keep thinking about the roles at the federal, state, and local level, and how to sort of what each can do best, and to develop programs around inherent strengths, and to use the other levels of government to use their inherent strengths to deal with some of the weaknesses that may exist. Many years ago, I worked for Wisconsin DNR, and there's Section 208 of the Clean Water Act, which everybody's forgotten about at this point in time, but they did a whole series of water management plans all across the country, a whole bunch of regional planning commissions. And my job was to implement the 208 plan for southeastern counties around Milwaukee. And so the regional commission would call me up sometimes and said, you know, it's gotten politically too hot for us. We got to bail on this. We're not going to make the environmentally sound decision. And they said, it's in your court. So then it was my job to come in and say, well, you know, the regional planning commission maybe is not going to make you do this, but we're going to do that, make you do what you don't want to do, to join up your sewage treatment plants between two communities or whatever it was going to be. And then when it got too difficult politically for us, I never did this, but in theory, what I would do is make a phone call to, you know, the Environmental Protection Agency or someone and say, look, we know what the right thing to do is. We are not going to be able to support us for, you know, various reasons internally. We're counting on you to help us make a good decision here. At other points, you know, it goes in other directions. But having those relationships in place and making good decisions around them is key. And one level of government cannot carry the entire load. So I'm looking forward to the discussion here later. And I don't know if you're going to postpone for questions or what your plan is, Roy. Well, as far as I can tell, in many cases, they don't deal with it very well. We had a meeting, we have an annual meeting last year. We had a number of folks that were new hires in Section 401 programs around the country, and we were kind of left with the impression that, at least in some states, not in any, because in part because of the very low level of staffing to begin with, when that one person left, all the institutional memory left with them. We're actually planning as an organization to try to develop some basic online training for some of these things that are somewhat generic, and make the case for more. But we see this as a pervasive problem that needs to be addressed for state programs. It's a problem in restoration and mitigation, that there's not the training for people to do wetland restoration correctly. So I think it's states spend money on the things that they value, and I frankly worry about this a lot, and I think that unless the public is convinced that investing in having good staff and having good, robust programs is important, that it is hard for the water program staff alone to make the argument for some of the training needs, particularly after the recession. So we worry about that. Thank you.